Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me and I guess see me. Um, I want to just welcome you to our first webinar for 2022. Um, kind of meant for weed inspectors and land managers, but really everyone is welcome. I know this presentation is eligible for continuing education credits for pesticide applicators. Just to let you know, the webinar will be recorded and it'll be posted onto the SARM website fairly soon afterwards. We will be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please type your questions into the chat box so we can see them. Everyone's going to be muted for the duration of the webinar, just to prevent interruptions, that kind of thing. So anyway, I am Katie Makahonyuk. I'm the Plant Health Officer for Division 1 with SARM, which is Southeast Saskatchewan. Yeah, so I guess I can get started. Okay, so like I said, I'm one of the plant health officers. There are 6 of us across the province. What we do is we assist RMs and First Nations and their appointed officials with the Pest Control Act and the Weed Control Act, as well as assisting the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture with pest surveys out in the field. So we have a little bit of office duties and a little bit of field duties, which is really nice. So today's presentation is Herbicides for Invasive Weed Management with Clark Brenzel. He's with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture and he is our Provincial Weed Control Specialist. So welcome, Clark. We definitely enjoy your presentations every time. So without further ado, we will put you on.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about today herbicides for invasive weed control. I'm going to kind of take a 20,000 foot view of these and not bore everybody with going through individual products in a lot of detail. Some of these labels have 40 some odd species on them, so we'll just kind of talk about things in generalities. If you are interested in more detailed information, we've made sure that we've got most of these herbicides in the 2022 Guide to Crop Protection that should be available in early March. And so if you pick up your copy there, you can go through there and see some more detailed information on these herbicides and their uses. So we'll just be kind of approaching this on an active ingredient level. But before we get into that, we want to just do some general comments on herbicides for invasive plant control. Each of the herbicides has its own set of benefits and limitations. Some things have long residuals, some things have short residuals. And depending on, and each has their own various spectrum of weeds and associated prices that will fit whatever particular situation is out there. There's a lot of overlap as far as the weeds that are on a lot of these labels, but each product has a few sort of key niche weeds that that will make them unique and sort of make them a better choice than maybe their other competitors. I think we need to make sure that we're choosing products based on what the expectations for land use are. You don't really want to get into a super residual herbicide if you're planning on breaking that permanent pasture or hayfield or whatever and putting it back into annual crops anytime in the next, let's say, 4 or 5 years. So Those are some things to kind of keep in mind. If it's something that's going to be staying in permanent pasture, it's tough land to get across. You don't want to be doing that any more often than absolutely necessary. And so more residual product may be a better choice for that type of activity. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that resistance is evolving, even in invasive weeds that are not all that common in Saskatchewan. They're typically evolving in areas where they are more widespread and tend to be under more intensive management. So an example of that is there's group 4 resistance evolving in spotted knapweed in British Columbia, where they have quite a bit of spotted knapweed, and so they're treating that on a regular basis, and as a result, they're getting resistance evolving in that province. We can describe herbicides typically via mode of action, and that is also sort of synonymous with herbicide resistance group. And essentially what that means is that that's the critical pathway in the plant that particular herbicide interferes with and prevents that plant from continuing its life cycle as a result. So essentially it's kind of like pouring a toxin and sort of going back to some comments made by my father in his misspent youth, is that if you pour sugar in gasoline, that makes a car not work so good. And so herbicides are kind of like pouring sugar in the gas tank of a plant. And you're essentially making it so that their engine doesn't run properly. And essentially at the end of the day, they can't support their own growth and they die. And essentially a lot of herbicides out there can be grouped into similar modes of action. And essentially what that means is that those particular herbicides within that group, even though they're different compounds, attack the same point in the plant. And so as a result, if a plant develops resistance to that particular chemistry, then that will be across the whole group of herbicides as a rule. There are some exceptions, but as a rule, it'll be across the whole group of herbicides. So generally, we look at these groups via numbers, and whether that's the WSSA system or the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee. WSSA is the Weed Science Society of America. Whether they're those two systems, they're all more or less synonymous now. There used to be letter systems in both the HRAC system and the Australian system, which were different from one another. So there was sort of odd things going on all across the world. So now a lot of this stuff is all standardized into the WSSA HRAC sort of standard. So that's happened over the last couple of years. So it's nice that we only have one system now across the world that we have to worry about. Essentially how a herbicide works is that you've got a target enzyme system in the plant that essentially acts like a catalyst. So it takes two components and maybe joins those together to make a bigger component that goes on to be a critical component in that plant's life cycle. You can also get these things going the other way, where you've got a waste product that you need to break down and it goes into that enzyme system, gets cleaved in half, and you get the two bits going off in opposite directions to go into other pathways in the plant. If we look at a herbicide system, essentially what happens is that herbicide fits irreversibly into that target enzyme site and prevents those components from getting in there and then creating that essential component for growth. And so that's where you get that system where the plant is limited as to the way that it can progress its life cycle. And so we've got a whole group of herbicide, or set of groups of herbicides on that right-hand side there that are all considered growth component inhibiting or quote unquote systemic type herbicides. So essentially they go into the plant, they circulate through the plant, They go to largely to the main growing points within the plant, and they inhibit growth in those main growing points. And that's where you'll see symptoms show up of those herbicides first. The other major class of herbicides is the membrane disrupting type herbicides. And so essentially what'll happen is that you'll get one of those, let's say in a system where you're detoxifying something, that herbicide will go into that system and it'll cause a backup of one of those components in that overall pathway, because you've got another system that's upstream that's sort of pumping out these components to go into this other target site. And so you may get a backup of that stuff. And a good example of that is you get ammonia backing up when you apply Liberty to a plant and you have the herbicide sitting in the target site like that. So this would be ammonia within the plant backing up to create, and the ammonia is toxic to the cell walls, or not the cell walls, the cell membranes. Those membranes break down and essentially all the guts of the cells spill out into the atmosphere and the plant dries down. We have other systems where this could be free electrons, or in the sort of the photosynthetic system where you've got energy from the sun coming in, it activates the photosynthetic system. You've got electrons flying around. They should be going into this target site to get added to things to create sugars, but they don't. And so they back up and they do the same thing. They disrupt membranes and they break down those membranes, and the cells dry out, the plants dry out too. So those are two rough groups. We also have some other processes that go on, and another main one is the one that we'll talk about quite a bit today, you'll notice, and that's the hormone mimic type herbicides. And essentially what they do is they're like the natural hormones in the plant. The difference is that the plant can manipulate its own hormones and break them down when they're not needed and produce more when they are needed. Whereas with the synthetic hormone mimics, what happens is the plant can't break those down, so they accumulate at higher levels in the plant than the plant can tolerate. And as a result, the plant succumbs and has all kinds of nasty side effects. The other thing to keep in mind when we're looking at how herbicides work in plants is the way that they move in plants. And so there's a couple of different movement systems. One is apoplastic, or essentially a passive system, where things flow in the water in the plant. So let's say you've got something in the roots. What'll happen is that the water will get taken up by the roots and move that material up and out into the leaves. And oftentimes what you'll see is a symptom in these cases, especially of sublethal symptoms, is that those symptoms will show up in between the veins first, or right at the very edges of the leaves. And so that's a good sign that you've got apoplastic movement. Symplastic movement is more active. It happens in the phloem. So what happens is that herbicide actually has to enter the cells of the plant and be actively moved within the plant through to, usually it goes towards the main areas of growth in the plant, which would be the growing points. And as a result, you have accumulation of those things in the growing points. So you'll get your symptoms showing up in those growing points first. So a good example is when you have group 2 injury on, so let's say a stinkweed, it yellows in the middle of the plant first. And the outside leaves that are older aren't affected until they have to go and repair themselves, and then they eventually succumb as well. If you're doing an application over the top with apoplastic, you really don't get much movement. And so a lot of these would be the contact products where they just get applied to the leaf surface, and they move maybe by a little bit by diffusion across the leaf surface or in between the cells. But generally they don't move. Whereas if we're looking at a symplastic system, again, actively move to the growing points with the sugars that are being produced in the leaves. That's a more active process, as we talked about before. One key thing with the symplastic movement is that with perennial plants, you may get things, particularly in the fall of the year, rather than moving to the main aerial growing points, they move to the underground growing points because that plant is now producing underground growth as a storage organ for survival into the following year. So we'll get into the active ingredients a little bit here now, and just look at those in a little bit of detail. Essentially, 2,4-D is probably the closest analog that we're going to get to auxin, which is a natural plant hormone. Again, plant can't break the 2,4-D down, and 2,4-D was originally developed as a growth regulator, and the idea was to try and mimic natural auxins in the plant to do experiments to learn more about how auxin moved in the plant. And what they found was that at relatively low concentrations, they ended up killing a whole bunch of plants, and particularly broadleaf plants. And so that's how 2,4-D became a herbicide. And so that happened back in the 1940s, and we've had it with us ever since. So we're looking at going on 80 years now. So it's a well-established herbicide and well-researched and well understood. Although we're still trying to find out some details on exactly how these growth regulator type plant hormone type herbicides function at the molecular level. We have a good understanding of essentially what goes on the plant, and generally what we'll get is a bunch of what I refer to as decoration happening in the plant, and so that you know that it's working. And that's the curling of leaves and twisting of stems and things like that that are distorted growth that result in kind of an out of balance hormone system. But where you really get the activity happening with these group 4 herbicides, the whole group of them, is that they create undifferentiated or unspecialized cells near the base of the plant that crushes those xylem or water transport tubes in the plant right at the base of the stem. And essentially you starve the top of the plant and for water, you starve the bottom of the plant for sugars for growth, and essentially the whole plant dies. 2,4-D has a really wide spectrum of broadleaf plants that it impacts. And so some pretty basic plants like mustards and parsnips, and some legumes, some composites like annual composites in the sunflower family. Essentially, when you've got like a daisy-like flower or sunflower-like flower, that's something that's a composite where you've got multiple seeds in a head, so to speak, and that would be representative of a composite. Grasses are tolerant but not resistant to group 4 herbicides, and so that's why you can get injury from these things under certain conditions. The way that grasses are tolerant is that they've organized those water transport vessels in their stems a little bit differently, and that means that they resist the pressure of that random cell growth more. And so the symptoms that you will get if you've got injury from one of these things oftentimes will mimic drought stress. So you'll get smaller leaves, you'll get more upright leaves where they're trying to preserve moisture, you'll get older leaves sloughing off, you'll get a really heavy wax deposition on the leaves that makes the leaves look like a light blue color rather than a deep green color. So you'll get those kinds of things going on when you get injury to a grass plant. 2,4-D is relatively inexpensive. It's essentially a foundation product for many other combination with many other active ingredients. So essentially it's the basic weed control that you can get for broadleaf weeds. And then if you have other things that you want to add in there to get niche weeds that the 2,4-D can't handle, then that's essentially what we do to kind of create more products. It's got a very short life in the environment, so it's basically considered to be non-residual. It's got the DT50 that I refer to there, that's the term that's used for the product half-life in the soil. And so DT refers to degradation time. So essentially what happens is that after that 6-day time frame, half of that product remains that was put on initially. Then if you go another cycle of that 6 days, then you've got a quarter left, and then another cycle you've got 12.5% left, and so on and so on and so on. Just keeps cutting in half every 6 days. That also means that 2,4-D can be used in many different habitats or crops. So it gets used in annual crops like cereals, perennial crops like turf and perennial grass pasture and range and IVM. So it's got a broad range of ways it can be used. And I think that in part reflects its utility, but also it reflects that it was one of the first things that was developed. And so when you're the first thing, you tend to get over applied in areas where you may not be the best suited, but you get a lot of things. You get into a lot of areas. One thing that is a caution is that the amine formulation or amine salt of 2,4-D can be antagonized by hard water or bicarbonate water, high levels of those ions in water. And there's no real way to get around that from an additive perspective. There's a little bit you can do if it's not super severe, but if it's pretty dramatic, then really the only way to kind of get around that is to look at the ester salt types or formulations that are out there, or switch to a closely related herbicide that's MCPA, and that isn't affected at all by water quality. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when looking at 2,4-D. Dichloroprop is a bit of an analog of 2,4-D. It's actually 2,4-DP, a 2,4-DP, and so it's essentially a propene version of 2,4-D. 2,4-D is acetic acid, and this would be proponic acid, I think. Anyway, again, it's a plant hormone mimic, and again, it's got a broad spectrum of weeds it impacts, very similar to 2,4-D. Essentially what it means is that this product doesn't break down in plants as fast as the 2,4-D might. So it's just a little more persistent in plants. It's low to moderately expensive depending on the rate that gets used, and there are a range of rates with this. So the half liter is for annual weeds and annual crops, 1.1 liters for perennial weeds and IVM, and 2.5 liters essentially for woody species and IVM. So there's no range in pasture uses for this, but it can be used in vegetation management activities, so like roadsides and right-of-ways and things like that you can use dichloroprop in. Generally, the products are made with a mix of 2,4-D, so they're esteprop and dichloroprop DX. And again, it's got a short life in the environment, very similar to 2,4-D. So rather than that 6 days that 2,4-D was, it's a little bit longer, so it's 10 days. The other common one that's out there is glyphosate, and glyphosate's a little bit different. It inhibits what's called the EPSP synthase system. And that system is responsible for producing a few essential amino acids for plant growth. And its group designation is group 9. Essentially, it's broad spectrum grass and broadleaf weed control, so essentially non-selective, unless you've got crops that have been bred to be tolerant to it. And again, they're tolerant, they're not resistant to it. So if you crank the rate up to a too high a level on those crops, you can injure or kill those crops that are bred to be tolerant. Essentially what it does, it blocks the growth of new tissues because they're short of those essential amino acids. Again, it's relatively inexpensive, well, except for it sounds like lately because of some shortages and things like that, but generally it's relatively inexpensive because there's many generic products out there, and so that's driven the price way down. It's bound tightly to soil, so that means it can be used immediately before seeding an annual crop. So that's where it gets used often. And really the half-life in the soil is about 47 days, which would put it into the moderate to long persistence category. But because it's tightly bound to soil, it doesn't impact plants that are growing in that soil. So that's what makes it relatively safe, particularly prior to seeding crops, or if you're trying to control vegetation below woody plants like trees, fruit trees, and things like that. So one thing to be careful of glyphosate is that it impacts anything that has green tissues on it. So yeah, if you're applying it below trees or perennials or things like that, you have to be really cautious about any kind of droplets that go astray from your application and may end up on those species that you want to retain, because it's really easy to do that. Trust me, I've done it. And so you have a plant that looks a little sick for a while. It's particularly effective on perennial species and at higher rates because it's one of those herbicides that flows with the sugars in the fall down to those perennial roots and does a really good job of taking care of any growing points that are forming on those perennial roots. Again, a cautionary note, it can be antagonized by hard water, so calcium, magnesium, and iron and other ions in the water. It's a relatively easy fix though. You just add ammonium sulfate, or in the case of iron, you can add citric acid, and that will correct antagonism. Dicamba, we're back to the plant hormone mimics again. It's in the group 4 category. It's a selective broadleaf weed control in permanent grass areas, as well as use in annual cropland at low rates. At pasture rates, it's strong on legumes, so things like clovers, local weeds, alfalfa, also the composite family. So now we're getting into some of the perennial composites as well as sunflower. We're looking at things like thistles and daisies and things like that. Polygonums, so docks, knotweeds, anything in the buckwheat family. Pigweeds, kochia, and field bindweed are key targets for dicamba. It's slightly persistent, so it's got a half-life of under 14 days, and it kind of depends a little bit on the environment it's being used in as to how persistent it is. It's bound very lightly to soil, so it has the potential to move in soil, but because of its relatively short half-life, there isn't a lot of leaching takes place with dicamba unless you're just putting on just extremely high rates that are on the label. Sort of cautionary notes, the DMA salts are very volatile and can be prone to vapor drift or inversion drift, where you get you get warm air at the soil surface trapped by cold air aloft, and what happens is that you end up with vapors trapped in that warm layer at the soil surface, and that once the breeze starts up in the morning, that layer can slide across the landscape and end up injuring sensitive crops. Some of the newer salts, like the glycoamines and the BATMA salts, are less volatile, but they're still somewhat prone to vapors. They're not completely free of vapors, but they're much better than the dimethylamine salts that were very volatile. Depending on rate, it can be moderate to high cost. So even for some of the lower rates, you're adding somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 for just a smidgen of it. It's pretty expensive at higher rates. As far as products go, there are IVM specific products like Banville VM, and I think that one's kind of phasing out a little bit because it's one of those ones with somewhat older salt in it a little bit. But there are others that are available for IVM and range and pasture products. There's lots of generics of dicamba around now, so to try and list them all is a bit wild. But key ones are BASF's newer product that's a higher concentration called Ingenia. And then there's another one that is from Bayer Crop Science, developed by Monsanto, called Extendamax. And it's essentially, it's a DMA salt, but it actually has a vapor suppressant compound in there to make sure that it doesn't move off target. One thing to kind of be aware of is that if you're mixing the Extendamax with glyphosate and you've got hard water, and you're putting in ammonium sulfate, that can undo that compound that inhibits vapor formation, and you can get more drift when you put that in. So that's something to be aware of, is that when you're using that Extendamax, you can't add any additives to it. Metsulfron, this is a little bit different group. It inhibits a pathway called acetolactate synthase. So it's a group 2. And what that does is it drives production of a different set of amino acids than glyphosate does. And those produce isoleucine, leucine, and valine. And these are, again, just like with glyphosate, these amino acids are important for the production of new plant tissues. And essentially the impact at the end of the day is pretty similar to glyphosate in the sense that when you're inhibiting that pathway, you're more or less stopping growth in a very similar way that you would be to glyphosate. It's used for selective broadleaf weed control in permanent grassed areas, particularly pasture, range, roadsides, IVM, and as well as annual crops at low rates. It is fairly persistent, so it does have some challenges when you're using it in annual crops. It's strong on the mustards, the composite family, so tansy, thistles, and daisies. Polygonums again, mints, so things like hemp nettle, henbit, things like that are all in that family that have square stems and opposite leaves. The carrot family or parsnip family, and so that would include things like wild parsnip or poison hemlock, things like that. Metsulfron does a very good job on. The pigweeds, you'll notice that kochia is scratched out there, and essentially resistance to this group developed back in the mid 80s, and today 99.9% of kochia populations are resistant to metsulfron. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, this group doesn't control kochia anymore. There are other species as well that have demonstrated resistance to this group. There's ample resistance in wild mustard to group 2 as a result of some um, over application of group 2s in pulse production in the southwest and west central areas. There's resistance in hemp nettle, there's resistance in cleavers, things like that. So there's lots of species around that are resistant to group 2s now. Cockle catchfly family, and then some woody species, particularly snowberry, rose, poplar, aspen, willows, and cherries, are controlled by much higher rates of metsulfron. It's moderately persistent to potentially long-term resistant. Its official half-life is about 30 days. It can be much more persistent at high pH. So where the soils have higher than about 7.5 for their pH, then this product breaks down primarily through a process called acid hydrolysis, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what happens is that under higher pH, that process pretty much stops, and it's not broken down very well by microbes, which is the other major pathway that we'll talk about. And so as a result, at higher pHs, it's very persistent. And because it's lightly bound to soils, it does have potential for leaching and mobility in soil. Cost is moderate to high cost based on the rate. So if you're looking at the woody plant rate, it could be a fairly high cost, but for most weeds, it's a pretty moderate cost. And for range and pasture and IVM, the product that's available is Escort. The annual crop product is Ally, but be aware that if you use Ally according to the label in a perennial environment, you're not going to get the same level of control that you would using the rates for Escort. And really on a product by product basis, Escort is cheaper than Ally on a pound per pound basis, so to speak. So at the end of the day, you're better off using the appropriate product for the appropriate environment. Another group 2 is tribenron, again, so exactly the same pathway that it inhibits. And again, it's used for selective broadleaf weed control, mostly in annual crops. It's largely an additive for pre-seed burn down or fall treatment, but it does have permanent grassed area uses on it for range and pasture. Again, it's strong on mustards, composites, so dandelion is a key target for this one, and at those higher rates in pasture, tansy and chamomile are potential targets as well. Again, polygonums like buckwheat and knotweeds are on there. Mints that we talked about before with metsulfron. Pigweeds, again, kochia is resistant. And cockles catchfly, and also buttercups are on the tribenron label. Group 2s are interesting in the sense that you take a common molecule and you kind of twist it a little wee bit. You move a group here to there, and you can get a quite different spectrum of weeds being controlled. So you can pick up very niche weeds with little tweaks to the molecule. Tribenron is not particularly persistent. It can hang around in soils for a couple of weeks, say. Particularly at those pasture rates, it's probably going to hang around for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at most. Its half-life runs in that 10-day range. And again, it's going to be slightly impacted the same as metsulfron in high pH soils, but it also breaks down through microbial activity. And so as a result, it's not as strongly impacted by those pH conditions as metsulfron is. And it's slightly bound in soil. It has, I guess, potentially has the ability to move in soil, but because it's so short-lived in soil, it's not likely going to happen. It's not likely going to move out of that sort of top, quote unquote, plow layer of the soil, so to speak. I would say that should be, rather than moderate to high cost, it should be probably low to moderate cost based on rate. So it probably has some niche uses in range and pasture, and yeah, didn't get that done right. So in range and pasture, the product that's available is Express SG. And again, there are a lot of generics for tribenron. There's a variety of different formulations. There's water-soluble granules, there's water dispersible granules, and the way those are a little bit different is that the dispersible granules are on clay that doesn't really break down, so you get a cloudy solution, whereas the water-soluble granules will completely break down in water, and as a result, you get a clearer solution when that product is in water. Because these things are affected by the acid hydrolysis, you can get breakdown in the tank if you have this stuff sitting in water in the spray tank for any amount of time. So pretty much all these things are delivered in dry formulations so that you don't get that happening. Aminopyralid is another group 4 product. We're kind of getting into a little bit newer technology when we're looking at aminopyralid. Again, for selective broadleaf weed control in not only pasture, range, roadsides, IVM, but also primarily in annual cropland. It's really strong on legumes, so clovers, local weeds, alfalfa, and composites essentially, and does have a little bit of activity on polygonums like docks and knotweeds. It's moderately persistent. Its half-life is an average of 32 days, so it's kind of getting up there again a little bit. It does have the potential to leach in soil because, again, it's not very strongly bound to soil at all. And it can be moderate to high cost based on rate. It's kind of in the middle range of expensive with respect to some of these residual products. And where you find this stuff is for IVM products. Milestone is the aminopyralid active ingredient by itself. Clearview is that aminopyralid active ingredient combined with metsulfron that we talked about earlier. And the range and pasture equivalents essentially take those two products above and add 2,4-D to them in the package. And you've got Restore with just the aminopyralid plus 2,4-D, and then we add the metsulfron into that mix. It's Reclaim 2 as well. Kissing cousin to aminopyralid is clopyralid. That one's been around for a little bit longer. Similar kind of spectrum. Used, and again, if I go back to aminopyralid, I was getting that confused with clopyralid. Aminopyralid is only used in pasture, range, roadsides, and IVM, whereas clopyralid can be used in annual crops as well. The nice thing about clopyralid versus aminopyralid is that there are many tree species that tolerate this quite well, and so it can be used in among like orchards and plantations and things like that for things like Christmas trees and etc. Same basic spectrum of weeds that aminopyralid has. It's again moderately persistent, fairly similar to aminopyralid, and it's also potentially mobile in soil. So very, very similar to aminopyralid, but just slightly different spectrum. The proprietary product is Lontrell, and there's lots of generics on the market now, so its price has come down a bit, but it's still moderate to high cost based on the rate that's being used. Immunocycle pyroclor is probably the newest of the products that are out there for invasive weed control. Again, it's another auxin mimic or group 4 product. Again, it's for broadleaf weed control and brush control in permanent grassed areas. So again, pasture, range, roadsides, IVM. It's also strong on legumes, so that those clovers, local weeds, alfalfa, the composites again as well. So sunflowers, thistles, daisies, knapweeds in particular. It's also active on docks and knotweeds. The difference here is the addition of leafy spurge as a potential target and buttercups as a potential target. So it's also moderately persistent, and there's different reports of how persistent this product is. Some of the work done at NDSU shows that its half-life is around 21 to 31 days based on environment. But other reports have it at 133 to 400 and something days for half-life. So it's really hard to kind of, because it's newer, it's hard to pin down exactly what that number is. But I think if we use that information out of North Dakota, then it's going to represent what our conditions are fairly closely. It's potentially, because of the persistence, it can be highly mobile in soil. So because it is lightly bound to soil. What its saving grace is that its use rate is relatively low compared to some of its competitors. And so that kind of makes it less of a problem for leaching into soil water zones and things like that. So that's it has a bit of a benefit that way from that perspective. In IVM and range and pasture, we've got the original product, which is Navius Flex. And then there's also an RMP range and pasture product only called True Range that came out here last year. That's exactly the same as Navius Flex. It's just priced about $20 less an acre than the Navius Flex is. So it's a bit of a benefit to the range and pasture users. Again, it's a moderate to high cost. And again, this is kind of old pricing, and we're probably going to have to make adjustments based on some of the supply chain issues and things that have been happening with herbicide manufacturing and things like that are causing challenges with the whole herbicide industry right now. But a couple of years ago, Navius Flex was in that $50 range per acre, and True Range is kind of in that $30 range per acre. Pikram is kind of the old reliable of the range and pasture and IVM selective weed control business. It's a plant hormone. Essentially, it's got limited production worldwide in the sense that it's produced as a byproduct of plastic car door panel manufacturing. And so there's a finite amount of this stuff in the world each year. And so each of the country business units for Corteva around the world bid on how much they want to purchase and what price they end up paying the mother country for, or mother manufacturer for this or business unit, so that they can get a hold of this and sell it as a herbicide. So it's it's a bit of a unique thing. Again, very similar to the other group 4s is that broadleaf weed control and brush control and permanent grass pastures. It's strong on legumes and clovers and composites and polygonums, as well as leafy spurge and potentially toadflax rather than buttercup. It's very persistent in soil. Its half-life is an average of 90 days, but can be upwards of in the hundreds at specific sites. So it can hang around for years. And for some of those very sensitive things like legumes, it can be 5-ish years under normal conditions, and under dry conditions, it could be even longer. So it's from that perspective, it's potentially highly mobile in soil as well because it is lightly browned. IVM and our range of pasture products, Tordon 22K and Grazon XC. Grazon XC is formulated with 2,4-D in the mix, and its sister product in IVM only is Aspect. Again, it can be moderate to high cost. So at the old target leafy spurge rate of 3.6 liters per acre, Tordon 22K can be in that $200 per acre range. So it could be very high cost for those sort of spot application rates. Half that for broadcast rates for things like toadflax and leafy spurge and things like that. And then moderate when you get down into use with Grazon XC, where you're kind of cutting some of that cost by having the 2,4-D in there as a companion product as well. So yeah, it can be fairly pricey, but if you're using it as a way to mitigate an initial patch, it can be fairly cost-effective option. Diphyphenzipur is a bit of an odd thing because it's not so much a herbicide on its own as it is a synergist for herbicides. It's called an auxin transport inhibitor, so it's group 19. Again, it's used for selective broadleaf weed control and brush control on either permanent grass areas or fallow and annual cropland. Diphyphenzipur, what it does is that it takes auxins, whether they're natural or synthetic like herbicides, and keeps them from moving from the place that they've either been produced or deposited, and focuses them on the growing points. And essentially what that means is that these things all accumulate in the growing point and cause the plant to be more strongly affected when this is used in combination with one of those auxin mimic herbicides. And typically it's pre-formulated with dicamba in products like Overdrive and Distinct. Overdrive for IVM and range and pasture, and Distinct for annual ag land. It's not persistent at all. It only lasts for like a week or two in the soil. Half-life of 4 days, so that's essentially nothing. That's less than 2,4-D. So it's essentially non-leaching because it's so short-lived in the soil. And it's low to moderate cost. So when we look at something like Distinct or Overdrive, it has a good fit in areas where you may have some environmental sensitivities. So you may have particularly light soils that it really doesn't, essentially you're ramping up the activity of dicamba by about double. And so it gives you some additional positive impacts of that group 4 herbicide without the additional group 4 herbicide, if that makes sense. So it avoids some of the negative environmental implications of the group 4 herbicide. In the US, what they'll do is they'll mix like Overdrive with one of the other group 4 products, and they'll get some enhancement of the activity of those products as well. And so I think the potential of this product really hasn't been realized as much in Canada as it has in the US. So it would be interesting to see some additional work on this in Canada and some additional mixing registrations. And relatively low to moderate costs because you're not putting it on at a particularly high rate. Well, we talked a bit about more residual herbicides, and one of the things I really wanted to talk about as a result of that was herbicide breakdown in the soil, and that's something that's a real key issue this year. There's essentially two key components to herbicide breakdown in the soil. One is chemical hydrolysis, as I talked about with things like tribenron and metsulfron. And essentially that's just a water molecule that comes in and splits that herbicide molecule in half. And as a result, it reduces its herbicide activity. So what'll happen is in those cases, it's called acid hydrolysis because it works more effectively in acid soils. And when you get into high pH soils, this process doesn't take place as well. The other key breakdown pathway is microbial activity, and that picture there is of a chromobacter, and that's one of the microbes in the soil that is implicated in the breakdown of glyphosate in the soil. By and large, microbial activity is the key breakdown pathway of most herbicides in the soil. I think the real key thing is that it requires ample rainfall and water for these things to break down in a reasonably predictable fashion. And so when you don't have rainfall, then you may have extended residue of these things in the soil. I don't know that that necessarily equals longer activity in the soil, but it can mean longer negative impacts for things that are sensitive to that herbicide and you want to put into that soil at some point in the future. So if we look at what's going on in the soil, the brown stuff is the solid parts of the soil. So we'll have silt, clay, sand, and organic matter in the soil. And then you'll have water that's bound to the outside of that. And so for a lot of these herbicides that we talked about today, this is kind of what we're looking at. They're not very strongly bound to soil. So you have roughly equal parts of the herbicide that's represented by the red dots there in lightly bound to the soil and available for the plant to take up in the soil water. For things like glyphosate that are strongly bound to soil, this is kind of what you see. And so you've got most of your molecules that are bound strongly to the soil and the occasional one that's floating around out in the soil water, but not at a high enough level that it impacts plants growing in that soil. One thing to keep in mind is that this is kind of a relative proportion. So the more of this stuff that you add into the soil itself, the higher absolute amount you'll get in there, but it'll try and maintain that same basic balance or proportion of what's residing on the solid portion of the soil and what's residing in the water. And then we have our little handy dandy microbe that comes along and chews up that stuff. And as that microbe consumes things, it tries to maintain that balance and pulls more off the solid portion and into the soil water, where again, the microbe can consume more. And so you have a happy microbe and no residue in the soil. With more persistent herbicides, what happens is that as that microbe is consuming, it runs out of time during that growing season, and we've got winter coming on and fall, and essentially you've got a sad microbe that doesn't get the job done, and you've got herbicides remaining in the soil. When you've got dry conditions, haven't got enough water that's in that system in order for herbicides to break down as predictably as we might expect. And so you've got things that just sit there and just don't go away. And if we look at what our rainfall conditions have been within the growing season over the last couple of years, they haven't been particularly conducive to breakdown. And so in our southwest part of the province in particular, we've got very poor conditions for breakdown in both 2020 and 2021. So that means that going into 2022, there's probably going to be way higher residues of those things that we applied in any of those other 2 years remaining in the soil than we would normally expect to see. And so that may mean that we're getting more persistence of some of those typically already persistent herbicides, and essentially very little breakdown of those things taking place over the past couple of years. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as time moves on, because that essentially just stops the clock. When you've got some of these like dark orange and red kind of conditions on the map, that essentially means that no breakdown is occurring under those conditions. And so you just essentially just take the persistence of that thing and back it up a year in the soil. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're making applications. And for things that have multi-year residues in the soil, if you're applying those things in back-to-back years, so you're doing multiple applications of something like aminopyralid, immunocycle pyroclor, pikram, things like that, then you can have buildup of those things in the soil under these moisture conditions. So that's something to kind of be cautious of, be aware of, because if you get buildup in the soil, once you do get rain in those things, in those systems, it's quite possible to get movement into the groundwater. And once you get that rainfall, that pushes those further down in the soil, because a lot of them break down primarily through microbial activity. The deeper they get in the soil, it's aerobic microbes typically. And so when you get deeper in the soil, you have less oxygen at those depths, and you get slower breakdown overall. So it can persist for a long, long period of time in the soil. So that's what I had to deliver here today, and I'm open to any questions.
Okay, we've got one question here about scentless chamomile. They're wondering what can be used in ditches for scentless chamomile.
A lot of those group 4 products all have activity on scentless chamomile. Metsulfron also has a little bit of activity on scentless chamomile. So the things like aminopyralid, clopyralid, immunocycle, pyroclor, pikram all have activity on scentless chamomile. And so add that into that little bit of activity that you also get from things like tribenron also has activity on scentless chamomile, is short residual in the soil. So there are lots of options. It's just a matter of picking the one that will fit your requirements as far as avoiding movement in water, a movement in soil, things like that. So yeah, you've got lots of options, whether it be group 4 or group 2. What I would probably suggest is try and use a product that has multiple modes of action to try and avoid that resistance. We already have essentially resistance to group 4, 2,4-D based herbicides. Within group 4, there are a variety of different subgroups, and essentially there doesn't seem to be a lot of cross resistance between those subgroups. And so for things like scentless chamomile, largely they resist 2,4-D right now, and probably because 2,4-D has been used as a management tool for quite a while, and so they probably become resistance before we really knew that resistance was an issue. Whereas some of those other group 4s that are a little more persistent and a little more active on that weed now still, so they're a little bit different subgroups, so they work a little bit differently. They're going to be more active on scentless chamomile, and so there is also reports of chamomile that in other countries that's resistant to the group 2s. And so what I would suggest is having multiple modes of action. So have a group 2, group 4 combination type product, and that will help to mitigate any development resistance going forward.
Perfect. Next question. What does the supply for Navius Flex look like for 2022?
I don't know. You will have to ask the Bayer Environmental Sciences about that, or any of the distribution agents for Bayer. One is Advantage VM. I just looked on the pestweb.ca for Vericis, and it doesn't look like they have a big herbicide catalog anymore. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. They have been in the past a key distributor of these products, but it looks like Advantage VM has a fair cross-section of products in there now and seems to be taking over as a major distributor of those products. So I would check with the manufacturer and check with the distributor to find out what the availability of those things is going forward.
Awesome. The next question is, there are many options for woody brush control in pastures. What would be an economical product for spot spraying?
I guess that kind of depends on the definition of economy, and if you have one thing that I didn't talk about for brush control, which typically isn't really considered to be invasives per se. We're not dealing with a lot, let's put it this way, we're not dealing with a lot of what would normally be considered invasive woody species. Ones that come to mind are things like tamarisk, so salt cedar, caraganas can be kind of invasive. Russian olive can be kind of invasive. I know I've got some Chinese elms or Russian elm plants that are just brutally invasive around my place, and escape where they're supposed to be and pop up all over the place. But things that are native are not typically considered to be invasive because they're supposed to be here and they're growing in the habitat that they've always grown in. And we've done something in the system to make it so that they're not sort of behaving themselves anymore. But from that perspective, if you're doing spot application and you may be looking at something that is relatively low cost on a larger area, but if you're sitting on a whole lot of inventory, that may not necessarily be all that cost effective. Each product, I think that's going to be a tailored question depending on the species. Again, very hard to paint a broad brush without knowing the species that we're talking about. And so I would suggest give me a call and I can answer your specific question that way. How's that?
Sounds good. Our next question is, what can be used on baby's breath? I've had trouble finding something besides Clearview to use.
Baby's breath is on the pikram label, so Tordon 22K. But it's also relatively well controlled by dicamba. It's at the higher rates of dicamba. If you've only got a few baby's breath plants, the thing that works the best is a spade. Just slice those things about 6 inches below the crown, and they don't have buds that are deep in the soil to regrow. So once you do that, then they're done. But if you've got a lot of them, then yeah, dicamba is probably the best value of rate by efficacy. on baby's breath.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have for now, so I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Clark, for presenting today. I know I learned a lot from it, and there was definitely a lot of information in there. So, for everyone else, thank you for attending. We really appreciate you being here. Stay tuned for our next webinar on February 16th about weeds to watch for. If you are not really familiar with the PHOs, I've put up a map here of the divisions and where they are and who is responsible for each division. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. If we can do anything to help you, we certainly will. So thanks again for being here, and we will see you on the 16th, same time, same place. Thank you. Bye.